A river worker found a bear cub hurled from a bridge. What he did next shocked everyone. The fog clung to San Francisco Bay like a death shroud, obscuring the bridge's tired spans. It was the kind of morning where the world felt muted, sounds swallowed by the dense gray blanket that hung over the water. Few cars traversed the old bridge at this hour, just after dawn, when most of the city still slumbered. Hank Rowley wouldn't have noticed the black SUV if not for the way it slowed to a crawl midway across the span, hazard lights blinking momentarily. From his vantage point beneath the bridge, a makeshift shelter cobbled together from discarded tarps and driftwood, he could just make out the silhouette as it came to a complete stop. At 58, Hank's eyes weren't what they used to be, but 15 years as a high-rise welder had taught him to notice details others missed. Something was happening up there. The rear door swung open. Two figures emerged, lifting what appeared to be a metal crate between them. In 3 quick movements, they hoisted it over the railing and released it into the churning waters below. The splash was barely audible over the wind. The SUV's tires squealed as it accelerated away, disappearing into the fog. Hank's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd seen people dump all manner of things from the bridge over his 7 years living beneath it, trash, furniture, once even a motorcycle. But something about this felt different, something about the way they'd moved, furtive, practiced. He scrambled toward his small rowboat, a battered thing he'd salvaged and repaired for collecting garbage from the bay. The aluminum hull scraped against the rocks as he pushed off from shore, his weathered hands gripping the oars with practiced efficiency. The current was strong this morning, pulling at the little boat as Hank rowed toward where he'd seen the splash. The metal crate was already beginning to sink, water seeping through the bars. That's when Hank heard it, a desperate, strangled cry that chilled him to the bone. Not something. Someone. He rowed harder, muscles burning with the effort. As he drew alongside the cage, the fog parted just enough for him to see what was inside. Not a human, as he'd feared, but an animal, a brown bear cub, its small body trembling, snout and paws bound tightly with plastic zip ties. Dark, terrified eyes met his, pleading. "Jesus Christ," Hank whispered. The cage was sinking fast. Without hesitation, Hank plunged his arms into the frigid water, fingers searching for purchase on the slippery metal. The cub thrashed within, panicked by the rising water and the stranger's hands. As Hank managed to grasp the edge of the cage, the frightened animal's claws raked across his skin, tearing through flesh. Pain lanced up his arm. But Hank didn't let go. Couldn't let go. Blood mingled with the bay water as he heaved the cage into his boat, nearly capsizing with the effort. "Easy now," he murmured, though whether to the cub or himself, he couldn't say. "Easy." The boat rocked dangerously as he worked to steady it, water sloshing over the sides. The cub lay in the bottom of the cage, chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. Its fur was matted and soaked, eyes wide with terror. Hank's hand throbbed where the claws had caught him, but there was no time to tend to it now. He had to get back to shore. Had to get this creature somewhere safe. With careful, measured strokes, he turned the boat and began rowing back toward his shelter, the morning fog closing around them like a protective veil. The irony wasn't lost on Hank, that he, of all people, would be the one to rescue a bear. 23 years ago, during a camping trip in Yosemite, his wife Margot had taken their 4-year-old son Daniel to use the bathroom while Hank prepared breakfast. They'd rounded a bend in the trail and come face to face with a black bear. Margot had scooped Daniel into her arms and backed away slowly, just as the park rangers had instructed, but the bear had advanced, curious and unafraid. It had been the most terrifying moment of Hank's life, sprinting toward them, shouting to scare off the animal while Margot clutched Daniel to her chest. The bear had eventually ambled away, but the fear had stayed with Hank. Even now, as he carefully cut away the zip ties binding the cub's snout, his hands trembled. "You're not going to hurt me, are you?" he asked softly. "You're just a baby. Somebody did this to you." The cub's fur was damp, body shivering from cold and fear. Once freed from the muzzle, it let out a pitiful whimper that stirred something deep in Hank's chest, something he thought had died along with Margot 5 years ago. Hank's shelter was hidden in an abandoned warehouse district, a forgotten corner of the city where the homeless and hopeless gathered. He'd claimed a small storage room in one of the more structurally sound buildings, outfitted it with salvaged furniture and supplies. It wasn't much, but it kept the rain off his head and the wind from his bones. Now he cleared a space in the corner, laying down his only spare blanket. The cub remained in the cage, watching Hank's every move with distrustful eyes. "I need to take care of this," Hank said, examining the deep gashes on his hand. He rinsed the wounds with bottled water, hissing at the sting, then wrapped his hand in a relatively clean bandana. It would have to do for now. Next, he needed to deal with the bear. It couldn't stay in that cage. But he couldn't exactly let it roam free either. He had no idea how to care for a wild animal, let alone a bear. But he couldn't bring himself to call animal control, not after what he'd witnessed. Whoever had thrown this cub into the bay had meant for it to die. Reporting it might just be handing it back to them. "Guess we're stuck with each other for now," Hank told the cub, "at least until I figure something out." He approached the cage cautiously, speaking in low, soothing tones. The cub backed away, pressing itself against the far side. With steady hands, Hank opened the door and stepped back, giving the animal space to emerge on its own. Minutes passed. Finally, either hunger or curiosity overcame fear, and the cub crept forward, nose twitching as it sniffed the air. It couldn't have been more than 2 months old, small enough to fit in Hank's arms if it would let him. Close enough to try. "You need a name," Hank decided. Names were important. Names meant you were somebody, not just another forgotten soul beneath a bridge. "Bruno." "Yeah, you look like a Bruno to me." Bruno the bear cub explored the small room with halting steps, flinching at every unfamiliar sound. Hank watched, transfixed by the creature's resilience. Someone had tried to kill this animal today. And yet, here it was, still finding the courage to move forward. Hank's stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday. His food supplies were meager, half a loaf of bread, some peanut butter, canned beans. What did bear cubs eat? Milk, probably. He had none. "We'll have to make do," he told Bruno, tearing off a piece of bread and placing it on the floor. The cub approached cautiously, sniffed the offering, then retreated without eating. Night fell, and with it came the familiar sounds of the warehouse district, distant traffic, the occasional shout, rats scurrying in the walls. Hank lay on his mattress, watching Bruno huddle in the corner on the blanket. Neither of them slept much that first night. 2 wounded souls, united by circumstance. Weary, but no longer alone. Ellen Shaw had seen her share of unusual patients in 15 years of veterinary practice. But the man who entered her clinic cradling a bear cub in his arms was a first. "Please," he said before she could speak. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes ragged. The bear cub squirmed against his chest, weak but alive. "He's been refusing food for 2 days. I think he's dying." Ellen's assistant moved to call animal control, but Ellen held up a hand to stop her. There was something in the man's expression. Desperation, yes, but also genuine concern. "Exam room 3, she said quietly. Once inside, she closed the door behind them. "You know I'm required by law to report this." He was thrown into the bay in a cage. The man's voice cracked. "I pulled him out. Somebody wanted him dead." Ellen felt her professional detachment waver. "Put him on the table." The cub, Bruno, the man called him, was severely dehydrated and underweight. As Ellen examined him, she noticed something unusual, a small puncture mark on his neck. Partially healed, but unmistakable. "This isn't a random injury," she said, frowning. "This is an injection site." The man, Hank, he'd finally told her, leaned closer. "What do you mean?" "I mean someone's been using this cub for something." She felt along Bruno's body, noting his distended abdomen. "I need to run some tests. Get fluids into him." "I can't pay much," Hank admitted. "I live under the bridge." Ellen studied him, the calloused hands, the intelligent eyes at odds with his disheveled appearance. A man who had rescued a bear cub despite having little himself. "We'll figure something out," she said. "But first, I want to scan for a microchip. If this cub was part of a legitimate research or conservation program, he'll have one." Hank nodded, hovering anxiously as Ellen passed the scanner over Bruno's body. The device beeped, confirming her suspicion. "Got something." She connected the scanner to her computer, pulling up the information. "Bear number 5, property of Aravo's Pet Solution Center." Hank repeated the words bitterly on his tongue. Ellen frowned at the screen. "I've never heard of them." "Let me," she typed rapidly, searching for information. Aravo's Pet Solutions, subsidiary of Levantra Pharmaceuticals. What would a pharmaceutical company want with bear cubs? Nothing good. Ellen's expression darkened as she continued reading. "It says here they're conducting conservation research. But this," she gestured to the injection site, "isn't conservation, and attempting to drown an animal certainly isn't research." "Can you help him?" Hank asked, his voice small. Ellen looked from the sickly cub to the homeless man who'd risked his life to save it, 2 lives society had deemed disposable. "Yes," she said firmly. "And more than that, I think we need to find out what happened to bears 1 through 4. Bruno improved rapidly under Dr. Shaw's care. A regimen of fluids, antibiotics, and proper nutrition worked wonders, though the cub remained unnaturally docile for a wild animal. After a week of daily visits to the clinic, Hank was allowed to take him back to the warehouse, along with supplies and instructions for his continued care. Ellen had discovered more about Aravos during that time. Public records showed they'd received permits for humane animal research focusing on stress responses in ursine species, all perfectly legal on paper. But the reality of a bound bear cub thrown into the bay told a different story. The permits were signed by a city council member, Ellen told Hank during his last visit. Someone named Victor Rossi. Doesn't that strike you as odd? Usually, these go through state wildlife agencies. Hank nodded absently, stroking Bruno's fur. The cub had grown comfortable with his touch, even seeking it out now. Everything about this feels wrong. It was on his way back to the warehouse, Bruno nestled in a modified backpack carrier, that Hank noticed the man following him. Average height, nondescript clothing, but with a purposeful stride that set off alarm bells in Hank's mind. He took a circuitous route, doubling back twice. Each time, the man maintained his distance but adjusted his course to match Hank's. Heart pounding, Hank ducked into a crowded coffee shop, threading his way through the tables to the back exit. He emerged into an alley and broke into a run, Bruno jostling against his back. By the time he reached the warehouse, his lungs were burning, but there was no sign of pursuit. That night, Hank barricaded the door to his room, positioning himself between it and Bruno's corner. Sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by every distant sound. Morning brought a hesitant knock. Hank froze, then slowly approached the door. "Who's there?" "My name is Ray. Ray Corderero." The voice was male, nervous. "I used to work for Aravos. I know about the bear." Hank's blood ran cold. "How did you find me?" "Followed you yesterday. I'm sorry for scaring you, but I had to be sure." A pause. "Paul, I want to help. I have information about what they were doing. Please." Hank cracked the door, chain still in place. The man outside was younger than he'd expected, maybe 30, with dark circles under his eyes and a haunted expression. "Show me your hands," Hank demanded. Ray held them up, empty. "I'm alone. I quit Aravos 2 weeks ago." After he swallowed hard, after what they did to Bear 4. Hank studied him for a long moment, then undid the chain. Ray's eyes immediately went to Bruno, who was watching from his corner. "He looks better than the last time I saw him." "You were there when they threw him in the bay?" Ray shook his head quickly. "No, God no. I was a transport driver. I brought animals to the facility, sometimes moved them between locations. I saw Bruno the day before he disappeared. They said he died during a procedure. They lied. They lie about everything." Ray reached into his jacket, slowly telegraphing each movement. He withdrew a USB drive. "That's why I brought this: shipping manifests, research protocols, internal emails, everything I could download before I left." Hank eyed the drive wearily. "Why come to me?" "Because you saved him." Ray looked at Bruno again. "And because you're nobody?" The words should have stung, but Hank understood their meaning. A homeless man was invisible, expendable in the eyes of those with power. Who would believe him over a pharmaceutical company? "I don't even have a computer," Hank said. Ray smiled thinly. "I know someone who does. A journalist named Clara Monroe. She's been investigating Levantra for months, environmental violations, worker safety concerns. This," he held up the drive, "could blow the whole thing wide open." Hank looked at Bruno, remembering how the cub had felt in his arms as he pulled him from the sinking cage, terrified, betrayed by the very species meant to protect him. "Tell me about the other bears," Hank said quietly. Ray's face contorted. "You don't want to know." "I do." Ray sank onto a crate, shoulder slumped. Bear 1 died during the initial trials, multi-organ failure. Bear 2 had seizures so severe he broke his own spine. Bear 3 supposedly escaped during transport. That was the official story, really. They euthanized her when the results weren't what they wanted. And 4, he drew a shaky breath, for made it the furthest. They were excited about his progress. Then suddenly they weren't. They ordered me to dispose of the body, but there wasn't one, just like Bruno. What were they testing? Some kind of adrenal stimulant designed to enhance aggression, pain tolerance, military applications, they said. But it was more than that. They were measuring something else. Something about neural pathways. I'm not a scientist, I just know they hurt those animals, made them suffer. Called it research. Hank thought of Bruno's unnatural docility, the way he'd barely fought back when handled. And Bruno, why is he so calm? They were altering the formula with each subject. Maybe his batch worked differently. Ray stood suddenly. We need to go now. They've been watching this area since Bruno disappeared. It's not safe. As if to punctuate his warning, there was a sound from outside, a car door closing, then footsteps approaching. Hank moved quickly, gathering Bruno into his arms. Back door, he whispered, leading Ray through the maze of the warehouse. They slipped out just as voices echoed through the building behind them. Ray led them through back alleys to a waiting car driven by a woman with sharp eyes and a determined set to her jaw, Clara Monroe. She introduced herself as they climbed in. I hear you have a story to tell me. Clara's apartment was small but neat. Walls covered in notes and photographs connected by colored string, a physical manifestation of the connection she'd been tracing. Levantra's CEO sits on the board of 6 conservation organizations, she explained, pointing to a cluster of photos. They donate millions annually to wildlife protection efforts, the perfect cover for what they're really doing. Ray had connected his USB drive to Clara's computer. The 3 of them huddled around the screen as documents flashed by. Bruno dozed in Hank's lap, growing larger by the day but still trusting, still gentle despite everything that had been done to him. There, Ray said, pointing. That's the protocol for the adrenal trials, Clara read aloud, her voice tight with anger. Subjects' pain threshold measured using standard stimuli at increasing intensities until maximum response achieved. She looked up. They were torturing them systematically. And here's the authorization. Ray scrolled to another document signed by a Victor Rosesian. He frowned. Someone named Lynn Walters, Chief of Security for the Research Division. The name triggered something in Hank's memory. Dr. Shaw mentioned a Lynn Walters, former police officer, now a veterinarian specializing in wildlife. Clara was already typing, searching the name. Got Dr. Lynn Walters, DVM. Works at the Golden Gate Wildlife Center, but there's nothing here about Levantra or security work. Could be a different Lynn Walters, Ray suggested. Or someone using her credentials, Hank said. We need to talk to her. Clara nodded. I'll arrange it. In the meantime, you and Bruno need somewhere safer to stay. They'll keep looking for both of you. The following morning found them at the Golden Gate Wildlife Center. Bruno was concealed in a pet carrier, Ray nervously scanning the parking lot while Clara led the way inside. Dr. Lynn Walters was not what Hank had expected, short and compact, with cropped silver hair and the alert posture of someone who had indeed spent time in law enforcement. I don't know any Victor Rossi, she said after hearing their story. Her brow furrowed in confusion. And I've never authorized any research protocols for Levantra or any pharmaceutical company. But your signature is on these documents, Clara said, showing her the files Ray had provided. Lynn studied them, her face darkening. That's not my signature. That's a forgery. She looked up, eyes blazing. Someone is using my name to authorize animal experimentation. It appears so, Clara confirmed. Show me the bear. Hank hesitated, then opened the carrier. Bruno emerged cautiously, sniffing the air of the examination room. Lynn's expression softened as she approached him, movement slow and deliberate. He's been through hell, hasn't he? She examined him carefully, paying particular attention to the injection site on his neck. This is criminal. Not just the animal abuse, but the identity theft. They're forging credentials, falsifying research permits. Will you help us? Hank asked. Lynn straightened. I spent 15 years as a cop before I went to veterinary school. I know how to build a case. Her eyes met Hank's. And I know what it's like to stand up for those who can't speak for themselves. The weeks that followed blurred together in a frenzy of activity. Clara worked tirelessly on her exposé, conducting interviews, verifying sources, and building an airtight case against Levantra and Aravos. Lynn used her law enforcement contacts to quietly gather information on Victor Rossi and his connections to the pharmaceutical company. Ray continued to provide insider knowledge, explaining the documents and protocols he'd smuggled out. Hank and Bruno stayed with Lynn in a small cottage behind the wildlife center. Bruno was growing rapidly, his coat glossy with health, his eyes alert and curious. He followed Hank everywhere, a silent shadow, no longer the terrified cub from the bay but not quite a normal bear either. Whatever they had done to him had left its mark. He's imprinted on you, Lynn explained. Plus, the drugs they administered likely affected his normal development, his natural instincts. He'll never be fully wild. The thought filled Hank with equal parts sadness and relief. He'd grown to love the bear, to find comfort in his presence, but he also mourned for what Bruno should have been, free, untouched by human cruelty. They weren't safe. Not yet. Twice, Lynn spotted vehicles parked near the wildlife center for hours, occupants watching through binoculars. Once, they returned from gathering evidence to find Bruno missing, only to discover him in the back garden investigating a piece of meat left behind, meat laced with sedatives according to Lynn's tests. They're getting desperate, Clara said after the meat incident. They know we're close to publishing. She was right. 3 days later, her exposé titled The Fifth Bear appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle. It detailed the entire operation, the illegal experimentation, the falsified permits, the 4 dead bears before Bruno. Clara had managed to obtain security footage from the bridge showing the SUV stopping and the cage being thrown into the bay. She traced financial records linking Levantra to bribes paid to city officials, including Victor Rossi. The story exploded across the country. Animal rights activists protested outside Levantra's headquarters. The FBI opened an investigation. And 3 days after publication, federal agents arrested Victor Rossi and the CEO of Levantra Pharmaceuticals, along with several scientists from the Aravos facility. The trial was set for 6 months later. Hank, Clara, Ray, Lynn, and Dr. Shaw would all testify. Bruno, now the size of a juvenile bear, had been officially designated as evidence, a living witness to the crimes committed. They'll want to put him in a facility during the trial, Lynn warned Hank. Standard procedure for evidence animals. Hank's heart sank. After everything, to be separated from Bruno now seemed unbearable. What kind of facility? Usually a government wildlife center. But Lynn hesitated. I've spoken with the prosecutor. Given Bruno's unique circumstances and your role in saving him, they might allow him to remain in my care, with you staying here as well. Relief washed over Hank. Thank you, he said simply. The night before the trial began, Hank sat on the porch of Lynn's cottage, Bruno resting his head on Hank's knee. The bear had grown so much yet still sought out these moments of connection, these quiet affirmations of trust. Tomorrow's the big day, Hank told him, stroking the thick fur. You and me, we're going to make sure they pay for what they did to you and the others. Bruno rumbled contentedly, eyes closing as Hank continued to talk. sharing his fears and hopes in a way he never could with another human. Somewhere along the way, this bear, this survivor, had become his closest friend. Morning came too quickly. Lynn had arranged for Bruno to wear a special vest marked witness for the trial, a sight that drew murmurs from the packed courtroom as Hank led him to their designated area. The prosecutor had fought for Bruno's presence, arguing that the jury needed to see the living evidence of Levantra's crimes. One by one, they told their stories. Hank recounted every detail of that foggy morning on the bay, his voice breaking as he described Bruno's terrified eyes looking up at him from the sinking cage. Dr. Shaw explained the medical evidence, the injection sites, the abnormal behaviors resulting from the experimental drugs. Clara presented her meticulous research, the paper trail of corruption and cruelty. Ray's testimony was perhaps the most damaging. He described hearing the cubs scream during procedures, watching as the researchers noted their responses with clinical detachment. He spoke of being ordered to dispose of bodies, to falsify transport records. Bear 4 was still alive when they told me he was dead, Ray said, tears streaming down his face. I heard him breathing in the bag, but I was afraid. But I just drove away, and I'll never forgive myself for that. Levantra's lawyers tried everything, discrediting Hank as an unreliable homeless man, suggesting Ray had stolen company property and fabricated evidence, and questioning Clara's journalistic methods. But the evidence was overwhelming. When they tried to argue that Bruno's docile behavior proved the experiments were humane, Lynn took the stand and systematically dismantled their claim. What you're seeing is not natural bear behavior, she explained to the jury. It's the result of neurological tampering. They've fundamentally altered his brain chemistry, his stress responses. This isn't a sign of humane treatment. It's evidence of profound neurological damage. The defense's final attempt came when they called their own expert witness, a researcher who claimed the experiments were necessary for developing life-saving medications. As he spoke, Bruno suddenly stood, a low growl emanating from deep in his chest, the first aggressive sound Hank had ever heard him make. The courtroom fell silent as the bear stared at the witness, recognition and fear evident in both their eyes. He knows, Hank realized aloud. Bruno recognizes him. The researcher faltered, his testimony derailing as he tried to avoid looking at the bear. The prosecutor seized the moment, pressing until the man admitted he had personally conducted procedures on Subject 5. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge's sentence was unprecedented, significant prison time for the executives and researchers, massive fines to be paid to wildlife conservation efforts, and the complete dissolution of Aravo's Pet Solutions. As for Bruno, the court ordered that he be relocated to a wildlife sanctuary in Northern California, with special permission granted for Hank to visit regularly and assist with his care. It's the best possible outcome, Lynn told Hank as they watched Bruno explore his new enclosure at the sanctuary. He'll have space, proper care, other rescued bears for company, and me. Hank added quietly, he'll have me. 2 years passed. The Northern Light Wildlife Sanctuary had become Hank's home as much as Bruno's. The directors had offered him a position as a caretaker, providing a small cabin on the property and a steady income for the first time in nearly a decade. Bruno had grown into a magnificent adult bear, his brown coat gleaming in the sunlight as he fished in the sanctuary stream. Though he still bore the psychological scars of his early trauma, he had adapted well to his new life, even forming cautious relationships with the sanctuary's other rescued bears. Hank too had changed, working with Lynn and Clara. He had helped establish the Harbor Haven Rescue Center in San Francisco, a place dedicated to rehabilitating abandoned and abused animals while educating the public about ethical treatment of wildlife. Lynn ran the medical side, Clara handled education and publicity, and Hank divided his time between the sanctuary and the center, his experience with Bruno making him uniquely qualified to work with traumatized animals. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when the unexpected visitor arrived. Hank was repairing a feeding station when he heard someone call his name, a voice familiar yet distant, like an echo from another life. He turned to find a man in his late 20s standing at the path's edge, uncertainty written across features that were at once strange and achingly familiar. "Daniel," Hank breathed, the tools slipping from his suddenly numb fingers. His son, the boy he hadn't seen since Margot's funeral 17 years ago, nodded, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. "Hey, Dad." Behind Daniel, a young girl of about 7 peered out, curious brown eyes taking in Hank's weathered face, his work-worn hands. "This is Leah," Daniel said, gently urging the child forward. "Your granddaughter." The word hit Hank like a physical blow. Granddaughter. He had a granddaughter. "Clara found us," Daniel explained. "She showed me the articles about what you did, about Bruno." He swallowed visibly. "I thought maybe it was time." Hank couldn't speak. Couldn't find words adequate for this moment. Instead, he knelt down to Leah's level. "Hello," he managed finally. Leah studied him with solemn eyes. "Daddy says you saved a bear." "I did." Hank smiled tremulously. "Would you like to meet him?" The girl's face lit up. "Can I really?" "If you are very quiet and calm. Bruno is special. He doesn't scare easily anymore, but he likes to know he can trust you." Hank led them to Bruno's enclosure, where the bear was sunning himself on a large rock. At Hank's familiar whistle, Bruno lifted his head, then ambled over to the fence. "He's so big," Leah whispered, eyes wide with wonder. "He was very small when I found him," Hank told her, "not much bigger than a puppy." "Someone had hurt him badly?" "But you made him better," Leah tried. Hank glanced at Daniel, who was watching Bruno with a mixture of awe and the old fear Hank recognized from that long-ago day in Yosemite. Some things can't be completely fixed, but that doesn't mean they can't heal enough to find happiness. As Bruno snuffled curiously at Leah's outstretched hand through the fence, Hank felt a strange peace settle over him. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the worn photograph he always carried, Margot laughing into the camera, her arms around a 4-year-old Daniel. "I didn't find peace," Hank said, handing the photo to his son, "but I found purpose." Daniel took the photo, his fingers tracing his mother's smile. "She would have been proud," he said quietly, "of what you did for Bruno, for all of them." Leah's delighted giggle drew their attention as Bruno gently accepted a piece of apple from her small hand. The bear's movements were careful, deliberate, as if he understood the precious nature of this moment, this bridge between past and future. "Can we come back tomorrow?" Leah asked, looking up at Hank with Margot's eyes. "I want to learn all about bears." "You can come back whenever you want," Hank told her, his voice rough with emotion. "This is your home, too." Now, as the afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long shadows across the sanctuary grounds, Hank watched his son and granddaughter sitting beside Bruno's enclosure. The bear had settled close to the fence as if wanting to remain near these new humans who smelled faintly of Hank's family. After all these years, after all he had lost, Hank had found family again, not just in Daniel and Leah, but in Bruno, in Lynn and Clara and Ray, in the broken creatures who came to Harbor Haven seeking a second chance, one rescue, one morning in the fog. That's all it had taken to transform his life from endless solitude to this moment of fullness. Hank thought of the 4 bears who hadn't survived, whose suffering had gone unwitnessed except by those who caused it. For them too, he had found purpose, ensuring their deaths were not in vain, that their story was told. Bruno caught his eye from across the enclosure, the bear's gaze holding the same steady trust it had since that first day in the rowboat. 2 survivors who had saved each other, finding their way forward through pain to something like redemption, not peace, perhaps, but purpose. And in the end, that was enough.